Welcome to another installment of Defending Israel. I am Rabbi Pinchas Landis. Quite often in the discussion of Israel's right to exist, people are quick to dismiss the claim that the land always belonged to the Jews, as if there is some kind of statute of limitation on land claims. You were out way too long, so it's not yours anymore. But how long was the land of Israel actually vacant of Jews and occupied by others? 2,000 years, right? That's what we always say. We were yearning for 2,000 years to return to our ancestral homeland. So we were out for 2,000 years, right? Wrong. Let's review the history. In the year 66, the Jews in Israel, called Judea at the time, revolted against the Roman overlords. The rebellion was crushed in the year 70 of the Common Era, with stragglers like Masada holding on until the year 73. Tens of thousands of Jews were murdered and carted away and became slaves. While Jerusalem was sacked at the time, the rest of the country remained overwhelmingly Jewish. Into the 2nd century, Jews were still a majority in the land of Israel, called Judea. In the year 132, the Jews once again tried to overthrow the Romans. While this revolt, known as the Bar Kokhba revolt, was initially successful, ultimately, the Romans prevailed once again, killing more than 500,000 Jews in the process. In the aftermath of this war, the Romans tried to crush the Jewish spirit once and for all, and tried to stomp out the Jewish people and the Jewish religion as a whole. They did their best to sever the Jewish character of the land. To this end, they even changed the name of the country from Judea to Philistia, or Palestine in the modern vernacular. That's where the name came from. Even after all this, the Jews still remained a majority in the country. This would start to change in the 4th century when Constantine became Rome's first Christian emperor. He and his son sought to make Jesus' home country firmly Christian and did so with terrible persecution of the Jews. The Jews tried again to revolt against the Romans, but it was not to be. The cities of Caesarea, Tiberias, and Lydia were destroyed by the Romans, along with thousands of Jews. Through all this, at the dawn of the 5th century, the Jews were still a majority in the northern region of their homeland and a significant minority in other regions of the country as well. The Talmud, which was written down at this time, lists 373 Jewish towns and villages in the land of Israel during this time. When the Roman Empire split in the year 395, Judea found itself in the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines were determined to carry on Constantine's work of Christianizing Palestine. To this end, they fiercely persecuted Palestine's Jews. Due to this brutality, by the end of the 5th century, the Jews were a minority in their homeland for the first time since the destruction of the first temple over 1,000 years before. In the year 614, still remaining a significant minority, the Jews sided with the invading Persians against the Byzantines. 20,000 Jewish soldiers joined the revolt. The revolt was successful, and the Jews were given control over Jerusalem. They made plans to rebuild the temple, and Jews started streaming back to Palestine. Though this was short-lived, because in 617, the Persians and the Christians made peace, betraying the Jews. And in 629, the Byzantines reconquered Jerusalem and killed most of the city's Jews. In the year 640, the Byzantines were overthrown by the new bully on the block, the Muslims. The Jews welcomed the Muslims, seeing in them a force that could finally free them from the brutal Byzantines whom they had suffered under for 250 years. After the Muslim conquest, Caliph Omar allowed 70 Jewish families to return to Jerusalem and even to build a synagogue on the Temple Mount. Now that the Byzantines were gone, many Jews began to return home. This benevolence would be short-lived. As Muslim culture and laws developed, the Jews in Palestine were heavily taxed and regulated to the second class. The Muslims appropriated Jewish holy sites like the Temple Mount, the Cave of the Patriarchs, and more, while Muslim policies transformed the whole region. According to the Arab historian, Muslims were still outnumbered in the Holy Land at the beginning of the 10th century. With the Crusades beginning in 1095, the Jews fought alongside the Muslims. Many Jewish communities were decimated. It was 100 years of turmoil. But in 1187, Saladin defeated the Crusaders, restoring Muslim rule and a relatively benevolent attitude towards the Jews in the land of Israel. Once again, many Jews returned home. Yet, as our story goes, the reprieve was short-lived. In 1250, the Mamluks took over and ruled the region until the year 1517. They had disastrous policies and plunged Palestine into new social and economic depths. During this time, 2/3 of the total population abandoned the country. It was then that Palestine first became a majority Muslim population, albeit a quite diminished population at that. Though the Jewish community was diminished at the time, it did get a boost when the Jewish persecution began in Spain, Portugal, and Italy. When the Ottomans took over in 1517, the Jewish community again found reprieve. The Ottoman ruler Suleiman the Magnificent knew that if the country was going to be reinvigorated, it would need the return of people. And who else was always willing to come to their ancestral homeland? By the middle of the 16th century, 30,000 Jews were living in Palestine. Though, after the death of Suleiman, the long and steady decline of the Ottoman Empire began. The 17th century saw Tzfas, Tiberias, and the communities of the north that had been so vibrant in the previous century laid in ruins by raids and pillaging carried out by Bedouins and Druze, not to mention several natural disasters. The 18th and 19th century were a dark time for Palestine. The total population of the region was 100,000 to 250,000 people, with about 6,000 to 8,000 Jews. Pilgrims always stressed the same thing: desolation and poverty. These are the numbers that we must look at when we discuss modern Zionism. A country that today holds over 10 million people held less than 250,000 people at the time. In the first part of the 19th century, foreign powers, sensing the imminent collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which would actually take another 100 years, began to open consulates in the country and to contribute to the development of Palestine. As always, when they could, the Jews began to return. The Muslims began to arrive as well to get a piece of the economic opportunities this Renaissance provided. By the year 1840, 5,000 Jews were living in Jerusalem, compared to 4,500 Muslims and 3,500 Christians. And in 1872, 11,000 Jews compared to 5,000 of each of the other Abrahamic faiths. By the year 1882, 2,000 Jews lived outside of the walls of the old city in 9 new neighborhoods that had been built. The Jews were also a majority in Tzfas and Tiberias at this time. By the year 1895, there were 30,000 Jews living in Jerusalem of a total population of 51,000. This was all before the official establishment of the Zionist movement in 1897. In short, the Jews never abandoned Israel. At every opportunity afforded to them, they tried to come back and rebuild. The whole time, they prayed for the return to Zion 3 times a day in their prayers and celebrated annual pilgrimage festivals heavily focused on the Jewish return to the land of Israel. Zionism was not some new white colonialism of brown people that developed. It was the modern organization of an ancient, never abandoned, and often acted upon idea.